but it's certainly the last budget hearing we'll have scheduled for the markup that hopefully is imminent of our bill. So you could say that we've saved the best for last, Mulvaney from South Carolina, to our Financial Service Subcommittee to discuss next year's budget request for his Office of Management and Budget. And before we get into the weeds of your office's budget request, I want to take a moment to commend you and your team and this administration for the President's budget. After reviewing it last month, my first thoughts were that this is honest and impressive, and which it was. It's realistic about the hard choices we must make to balance the budget and tackle the national debt. That's something we haven't seen out of the White House in a long time, so Mr. Director, thank you for your input there, and we know that your fingerprints are certainly on that proposal. The budget proposes to cut $3.6 trillion over 10 years while making key investments to spur economic growth and job creation. It includes major middle income and business tax cuts and $1 trillion of public and private partnership for national infrastructure projects. It also builds upon our recent spending cuts and further reduces the size of many of the federal agencies. And the President rightly wants to have fewer bureaucrats around to regulate our lives in order to free up funding for border security and rebuild our military. So I look forward to continuing the discussion on the President's vision for balancing the budget here today with you, Mr. Director. And like I shared with Secretary Mnuchin last week, I also want to mention to you that I'm grateful for the swift action that this administration has taken to jumpstart our economy. Just over the last few months, the administration has issued executive orders to streamline the federal government, reduce waste and duplication, and cut red tape. The positive effects are already being felt throughout our economy. Small business optimism is at a 10-year high, consumer confidence is at a 15-year high, and manufacturing optimism is at a 20-year high. Once more, since the President took office just 5 months ago, GDP has increased 1.2% in our country, and more than 600,000 new jobs have been created. Unemployment is now down to 4.3%, and that's the lowest in nearly a decade. That means more people are experiencing the dignity of work and the fulfillment of providing for their families. So, Mr. Director, let me say thank you to you and the administration for the swift action and the actions that you've taken. So now back to your budget request. The administration is requesting $103 million for next year, which is an increase of roughly 8.6% for the Office of Management and Budget. In this budget climate, that increase is somewhat unique, and I'm sure that, Mr. Director, you're going to be asked about that and what you're going to accomplish with those additional funds in a transparent way. So I'm going to keep my opening statement short so we can move into questions shortly after we have some opening remarks from some of our other members. And with that, I'd like to recognize my ranking member here, Mr. Quigley from Illinois. And I know he'll have a question or two later on today, but right now I'd love to recognize you for any opening remarks you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if it's okay, the ranking member of the full committee is on a tighter crunch if she could speak first.
Without objection, absolutely. The ranking member of the full committee, if you'd like to be recognized now for any opening remarks you have, we certainly welcome you. Thank you for joining us today as well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, Chairman Graves, and Ranking Member Quigley for holding this hearing. Director Mulvaney, I thank you for returning to the House to testify before us today. Director Mulvaney, your budget requests $103 million for OMB, an $8 million or 8% increase above fiscal year 2017. You propose this increase to hire 30 full-time employees, 18 of whom would be devoted to a category of office that rely on political appointees. As I'm sure you're aware, OMB already receives $95 million for the past 2 years, exceeding the highest appropriation level for OMB in its history by $2 million. This budget would set a new record for OMB funding, this time by an even larger margin, while all other federal agencies are being instructed to scale back. Director Mulvaney, I'll be frank. You boost your department at the expense of hard-working, tax-paying families. Here are just some of the eliminations you propose. Legal Services Corporation, which provides civil legal aid to low-income Americans, would be eliminated. Legal Services of the Hudson Valley in my district served a total of 6,750 cases in 2015. That same year, South Carolina Legal Services served even more people, closing 6,770 cases. Without LSC, these Americans would have limited access to legal representation. You would hurt academic opportunities for nearly 2 million kids by eliminating after-school investments. Cut off funding for the public broadcasting and end community development block grants, cutting off access to funding for community improvements, Meals on Wheels, as well as the Home Investment Partnerships Program, which keeps low-income people in stable housing. Now, as you well know, this isn't even a comprehensive list of your proposed eliminations, let alone the cuts. If this budget is implemented, families will suffer, the sick will get sicker, our environment will deteriorate, and our communities will grow more polarized. It is clear through these unconscionable choices that this budget request is merely a self-interested, ideological document fulfilling campaign promises, not an attempt to improve the lives of hardworking American taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. Now I'd like to recognize Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Freeling.
Well, thank you, Chairman Graves. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it, Chairman Graves?
Thank you, sir.
Congratulations on your assignment. I know you'll do us proud. And, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the time. I also want to welcome our former colleague, Mick Mulvaney, to the Appropriations Committee. You have an enormously difficult job, and we wish you Godspeed, and we look forward to your testimony and hearing your views, very candid views on many issues this afternoon. Today's hearing continues the oversight duties of this committee. As part of our analysis, we are in the process of going through each and every budget you've sent us and are asking for credible spending justifications from the agencies, all the agencies of the federal government, and from members of the President's cabinet. When we're completed our examination and receive the answers we need, and I'm sure we will, we'll make our own determinations on the best and most effective use of tax dollars. I recognize that this hearing focuses on the budget and operations of the Office of Management and Budget itself, but allow me to make a few general observations. Mr. Director, I do believe that most American people embrace the goals of the America First budget to rebuild our military in the face of growing global threats, strengthen border security, and eliminate unnecessary programs, waste, duplication, and modernize outdated programs. However, the national debate today focuses oftentimes on how you define unnecessary programs. We're eager this afternoon to hear your views in greater detail about those types of programs and how we keep our government open for business, working on behalf of the American people. So a warm welcome to you, and I thank the Chairman for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And now back to the ranking member, Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to join us in welcoming Director Mulvaney to the committee. Thank you for making time to be here today. As the office charged with developing the President's budget, you are uniquely positioned to provide us with background and insight on the various priorities of this President. And although it is true that much of the President's budget, any President's budget, is never adopted, these proposals still serve as an important window into the President's values and set the foundation for policy initiatives for the remaining years of the administration. And we like to begin these statements with a few positive comments and touch on some areas of agreement. Frankly, this is a tough year to do that, because instead of fighting for our families and putting the American people first, this budget is comprised of rather cruel spending cuts that can destroy job-creating programs, weaken our national security efforts, and strip support and resources from our most vulnerable individuals. 3/5 of these cuts, or $2.5 trillion, come on the backs of low and moderate income people, 1.6 of which comes from slashing Medicaid by nearly 50%, throwing millions of struggling Americans out of health care. $193 billion cuts into SNAP, reducing the program that helps feed 1 out of every 4 children by more than 25%, and hundreds of billions in additional cuts to safety nets like the $72 billion slash from disability insurance and 22 from TANF. Also from someone who on the campaign trail was the greatest jobs president ever created, in quote, this budget fails to make the investments necessary to advance our competitiveness and grow our economy. At a time when the U.S. suffers from a D-plus infrastructure rating, this budget slashes funding for vital transportation grants like Tiger and Core Capacity, and even strips money from the Army Corps of Engineers. It would gut support for job training grants and employment services by cutting state grants for career and technical education by $166 million and nearly cut in half the funding for the federal work-study program. In total, funding for jobs training is cut by 40%, and the budget would hamper life-saving investments in science, medical research, and disease prevention by cutting NIH by $6 billion and the CDC by $1.2 billion. These cuts will mean less money to respond to outbreaks like Zika and less funding for new cures and vaccines to some of our most devastating diseases. I'd also like to point out the President's budget hinders the security of this country by prioritizing a wasteful border wall over agencies and programs we know keep Americans safe. By cutting the State Department by 30%, we are compromising our ability to conduct diplomacy in a world more complex than ever. The budget also cuts overall development funding in half, slashes international disaster assistance by 43%, and completely eliminates the U.S. food aid program. I understand that in the past you said this is a hard power budget, not a soft power budget, but by approaching foreign policy through a purely militaristic framework, we increase the likelihood of endless war and relinquish our moral leadership on the world stage. I can go on about all the ways this budget betrays our hardworking, forgotten men and women of this country, but I also want to briefly talk about how intellectually, respectfully, dishonest this budget is. First, the budget assumes that GDP will grow by an average of 3% over the next decade, 1 percentage point higher than the CBO's forecast. That leads to deficit projections that are $3 trillion less than if CBO GDP estimates are used. These excessively optimistic growth projections, while a worthy goal, are highly unrealistic given current demographic trends and the vastly overstated benefits of the administration's deregulation and tax policies. Secondly, the budget uses the additional revenue collected through increased economic growth to both help pay for tax cuts and to reduce the deficit. Clearly, the same money can't be used twice, which means that this budget would not actually balance by 2027 as are currently forecast. Budgeting and accounting gimmicks notwithstanding, this budget will roll back progress and opportunity for millions of American families, many of whom voted for this president on the belief he would stick to his populist campaign platform. I do look forward to discussing these and other issues with you today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Now, Mr. Director, we know that you've submitted a statement that'll be for the record, but certainly welcome your highlights of that statement or any other comments you would like to make in a 5-minute setting here to highlight some of the positive impacts of your proposals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do enjoy calling you that. I've heard you called a lot worse, but I like Mr. Chairman. That's pretty good. And I'm not going to read the opening statement. My experience when I was sitting up there is that one of the most boring things a witness can do is read the same opening statement we gave you yesterday. So let me just sort of hit the highlights, and then we can talk about a lot of things that just got mentioned here. Thank you for the chance to come here and talk about not only the budget for the Office of Management and Budget, which I oversee, but also the larger Executive Office of the President, which is in which the OMB sits, and then obviously, if it's the will of the committee, to talk about the larger budget, some of the larger macro issues that we have. I will tell you this, is that I see the OMB EOP budget as simply a microcosm of the larger budget. Why do I say that? The larger budget did a couple of things when you look at it with broad strokes. It prioritized and spent more money on things that were important to the president, and it spent less money elsewhere. That's the same thing we do in the EOP OMB budget. We spend more money in a couple of different places. I think someone raised the point about how the OMB line item goes by 8%. We could talk about that in a second. I don't think that's exactly right. There have been some numbers that have changed. But yes, money is spent there, and money is reduced in other places along the lines of the priorities of this president. So when you look at the OMB EOP budget, you're sort of looking at it through the same perspective that we looked at the larger budget. At the same time, that same general perspective we brought of looking at taxpayers first, looking at spending through the eyes of taxpayers, we use that in our own budget. Could we justify spending money on this versus that? Could we justify spending more money here versus less money over there? And so the process that we went through was entirely consistent with the OMB EOP budget. I do look forward to the broader discussions, however, about the larger budget. I do look forward to the discussion about gutting and cutting and slashing. When we all know that at many, many levels, what that means is that we're slowing the rate of growth. And I do welcome those discussions, Mr. Chairman, because sometimes I think we use a different language in Washington, D.C. than ordinary human beings use back home. If we spend $100 on a program last year and $104 this year, many of us would call that a cut in Washington, D.C. I can assure you back home that is an increase. So I do look forward to having those larger conversations about what this budget is, what it is not, the moral values, Mr. Quigley, that are reflected in this budget. I do look forward to having that conversation. I hope we get a chance to follow up on many of the things that you've said. Very briefly, I will address the one thing that the ranking member on the full committee mentioned about the 30 positions. None of those, Ms. Lowy, are political. Those are all professional positions, and I can talk more about that if you like during the questions. I just want to clear that up right away. We're not proposing to add any political positions. They're all professional, and even if this committee was to see fit to give us full authority to do that, we would still be below the high in terms of the FTEs, which I believe was in 2010. But we can get into the details as we go forward. Anyway, I can't tell you how just privilege and honor is to be here. I don't think I was ever in this room when I was here except to pick up the keys to my new office, because this is where we did the lottery the last time I was here. And I did swing down to my old office, which is now locked, because I was down around the corner and they wouldn't even let me back in there. So I do look forward to being here and to asking the committee's questions for as long as you see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Director, and the committee certainly welcomes your participation today, and I think many on this committee might see the unique irony of the position in which you sit now versus the positions you advocated for previously in your tenure, and I would maintain they're very consistent, and you have not changed in any way. Mr. Director, first, let me just say, in my opening statement, I mentioned that my first impression of the president's budget was that it was impressive and it was honest, and many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would question that, and yet it was impressive because for once in modern time we've had a president who made campaign promises and kept that campaign promise, and that was proposing a plan that would balance our budget for our country while also restoring our economy and rebuilding our military. And it was honest because it showed exactly what decisions have to be made in order for that to be accomplished. And so you have been in the middle of that debate and conversation for not too long, quite frankly, and sometimes we give the administration or members of the administration far too much credit for their tenure, when in actuality it's been less than 5 months for anyone, or just over 5 months from January 20th. So thank you for your hard work early. Let me just go ahead and get to the meat of it real quick. So your budget might be one of the only ones that proposes an increase. And whether it's 8%, 7%, whatever the number is, why don't you just go ahead and address that for the committee, because I know you want to get that out of the way and get it out of the way.
I'd be happy to. The OMB budget, the 8% was an early number, I think, that may have made it out into the press. That was compared to when we first wrote the budget, Mr. Chairman. We had to use a guess as to what the 17 Omni would look like. So what we did is we took the 17, the CR for the first half of the year, and annualized that. So if you look at it compared to that, I think the OMB number is 8%. If you look at it in terms of the enactment, and if you look at ITOR, keep in mind OMB also includes ITOR, ITOR, the Information Technology Oversight Reform. And if you look at OMB like that, then the OMB number is actually up 5%. But the overall EOP, the Executive Office of the President, of which OMB is a piece, is 3% down from the 17 enactment levels. Why is that? Why are we spending more money at OMB? Most folks know us for the B in OMB, which is the budget function. The management function, which is the M, is another thing that we do at OMB. What's missing is the R. OMB is charged with regulatory affairs. We have the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, often known as OIRA, and also within OMB is the Office of Performance and Personnel Management, OPPM. OIRA and OPPM are the agencies within OMB, within the EOP, that are primarily responsible for two of the President's highest priorities. This is the executive order that deals with the reorganization of the executive branch of government, and the executive order that deals with the deregulation of government, of the private sector through the two out before one comes in regulatory policy. OIRA is responsible for implementing that, and the OPPM is responsible for taking charge of the restructuring of the government. Two of the largest initiatives. You mentioned some of the changes and optimism in the country since the President came in. I would suggest to you that a big chunk of that is because of those two executive orders, sweeping executive orders, that we're going to look at the executive branch of government from a blank slate. I mean, how exciting is that to those of us who are excited about government? For the first time in 2 centuries, we get a chance to look at government from scratch, and OMB is responsible for that, a huge undertaking. At the same time, the President's deregulatory stance, a big part of his campaign, a big part of our economic policy, also the responsibility of OMB. So you will see us spending more money on places that are the President's priorities and less elsewhere, just as we did with the rest of the budget.
Great, thank you. And that'll, before I pass it on to Mr. Quigley, let me just remind, okay, yeah, Ms. Lowy, we'll go to Ms. Lowy next, but before we do that, let me just remind the members that the process in which we go here is obviously it's 5 minutes. We try to constrain the questions and answers in, and Mr. Mulvaney knows the drill better than anyone, I imagine, as well as anyone. And so feel free to respectfully redirect if you feel like he's not getting to the question that you had asked. And then we'll also be going in order of seniority as we're placed here when the committee opened. Is that correct? Is that what you've got listed here? So, all right, so it'll go Ms. Lowy and then Mr. Yoder in that order. Ms. Lowy, you're recognized for any questions.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask you a few questions again about the budget cuts. In my judgment, the budget makes a number of unconscionable cuts and eliminations and assumes that state and local governments will find room in their already constrained budgets to replace federal funding. In the very first year of this budget, fiscal 2018, states and localities would need to come up with an additional $44 billion to maintain the programs the federal governments would simply drop under your proposal. And at a time when state and local governments are struggling, I'd like to know what makes you think states will be able to replace the lost funding without either raising taxes significantly or cutting key investments and public services. To me, your budget is a perfect example of the federal government hiding costs by burdening states and, as a result, increasing taxes on hardworking Americans. Realistically, do you see any way that charities, local governments, other revenue streams make up this funding gap without increasing taxes or slashing services beyond repair? I don't think this budget or your reasoning is based in reality. This administration seems blindly unaware of the consequences of its action. And I'm talking about each of the bills. I've been doing appropriations for a long time, and whether it's Head Start, after-school programs, all the energy programs, I won't eliminate them all here. But how is the state going to pick up these programs that are so essential to people and their quality of life without raising taxes? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Ms. Lowe, I think one of your questions was hiding costs. We're trying to do the exact opposite. We've done this on purpose for the exact opposite reason you mentioned. We are not trying to hide costs. We're trying to expose them, and I'll give you one example. I think SNAP is the one that probably gets the most attention. Food stamps, what some folks call food stamps. Right now, the federal government picks up half of the administrative costs for that program, and the states pick up the other half. But we pick up 100% of the benefit. Okay, so it's administered by the state, but we pick up the costs. And I would suggest to you that there's zero incentive, because I was in the state legislature, so I've seen this, you may have been as well, zero incentive for a state to worry about what it costs. So yes, we have introduced cost sharing in various programs. The one that gets the most attention is SNAP, but there are others. Simply under the premise that the folks who are administering the program, the folks who are actually seeing how it works in our communities, are the folks who are best positioned to understand what they cost, what benefits they provide, and how to do a better job. I remember being in the state legislature going, oh, I wish we had more control over how we did this program, but we didn't have a chance to do that. We try to give the states the authority to do that. Yes, we have them put skin in the game. There is no question. And if you want to criticize us for that, that is a fair criticism. But the point of the matter is when you look at it from the perspective of the federal taxpayer, we are better off if the folks who are providing those benefits also have a stake in keeping the costs down in the long term.
I'm a little puzzled. You're saying it's the same one. I'm a federal taxpayer, I'm a state taxpayer, and I'm a local taxpayer. So you're saying I'm keeping the program pace, but you're going to increase. Do your local constituents who support you approve you're raising their local taxes?
You are the exact same person, right? I live in South Carolina. I pay taxes in South Carolina. I'm also a federal taxpayer, right? Right now, from my perspective, there is no one watching those programs and looking at those programs with an eye for me, because the state folks who administer it don't have any skin in the game at all. So as my taxpayer, both at the federal and the state level, I think it's fair for me to say, you know what, I'd really like the folks who are running this program to have some incentive to do it better. I don't think that's at all unreasonable. We disagree about the philosophy behind it, but at the end of the day, the point of the matter is we think it's best for the taxpayers if the folks who are administering the programs actually have some skin in the game.
Well, I don't have much time left in a couple of seconds, but I do hope when the president goes to your state or my state, he said, I'm proud that you're going to administer this program and your state taxes and your local taxes are going to go up or people are going to be hungry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All the more incentive with the 10 seconds I have left to say, you know what, maybe there's a good way here to save money so that everybody benefits.
I think it's important that we focus on how we are feeding people who are hungry, educating our children, providing a bright future, helping people get a job. And I haven't seen any rationale for that in changing the tax structure and raising my state and local taxes. But I'm out of time. Thank you for your generosity.
And we'll go to Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Mulvaney, welcome to the committee. It's good to see you back in the Capitol area here. I want to commend your commitment to reducing deficits and streamlining the federal government. And as you said in your testimony, Washington tried to help Americans by simply growing government, and we know that this did not work. The federal government is bloated, and we all owe it to ourselves, Democrats, Republicans, the administration, to rein in spending and rein in our national debt crisis. The present budget request lays out a roadmap to balancing the budget and shrinking federal spending as a percentage of GDP. The budget projects to reduce deficits by a total of $5.6 trillion over 10 years compared to the current baseline that we are on pace for. This is a significant reduction and a commendable goal, but I would like to talk to you about your plan on how to get there. The President and his budget requests have put a lot of emphasis on reducing non-defense discretionary spending. However, as you know, non-defense discretionary spending only makes up about 15% of the total budget. And while there is always room for increased efficiency, this is not the part of the budget that poses the long-term problems for our national debt, as you know. Mandatory spending is a long-term problem. For example, the President's budget request projects that by 2027, we will spend over $2.8 trillion per year on Social Security and Medicare, but only bring in $1.8 trillion in payroll taxes for those two programs. That's a net loss of $1 trillion. We agree that there are priorities that the federal government should be investing in for the good of our people, like medical research or early childhood education, and we can't afford to make these investments if entitlement spending devours all the available funds. Do you believe that our budget problems can be solved without entitlement reform? Does the administration acknowledge that mandatory spending is part of the problem, and does the administration have a plan to address it?
Those last three rapid fire?
Sure.
Read those back.
Do you believe that our budget problems can be solved without entitlement reform?
No.
Does the administration acknowledge that mandatory spending is a problem?
Yes.
Does the administration have a plan to address it?
Yes.
And it's not in this budget. So what? So
Well, it is. It is and it isn't. Mr. Yoder, I think you may be referring to some large components of mandatory spending, which are Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. And I think I've said many, many times that I advocated to the president, as I said I would during my confirmation process, that I would advocate for reforms to those programs. And I've sat down with the president 4 different occasions in the Oval Office and went down the list of possible mandatory reforms. We spent a great deal of time on it. He got up to speed on all of the issues. And at the end of the day, he went down the list and said, yes, yes, no, no, yes, no, no. And the ones that were no were Social Security, retirement, and Medicare, because he said, I promised people when I ran for office that I wouldn't change those. I'll be perfectly candid with you. When I walked out of the room with the list of yeses and nos, I did not think it would be possible to balance the budget within 10 years. I was surprised that we could by looking at other parts of mandatory. There are other mandatory programs, as you know, outside of just Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. But we were able to do that. So that's why I say, yes, we do know that we have to look at the mandatory side of things, and yes, we do have a plan, and no, you can't fix it without it. Everybody, I think, accepts the fact now you cannot balance the budget on the discretionary side of the ledger alone. You certainly can't do it just with non-defense discretionary, and you can't even do it with the defense discretionary added in as well. We didn't even try and do that. When you looked at our budget blueprint from March, what you saw was all we tried to do is not add to the deficit by increasing spending on national defense and border security and law enforcement. We didn't balance the budget on the discretionary side. We simply didn't add to it. And the only way you're going to balance the budget long term is by looking at those mandatory payments, because as you point out, they are 2/3 of every dollar that we spend.
I appreciate you speaking to that issue, and I think this committee is committed to joining you in an effort for long-term budget deficit reduction. I want to point out a couple reductions on the non-discretionary, or I'm sorry, on the discretionary non-defense side of the ledger that I have some concerns about. One of them is reductions to the NIH budget. I want to point out that Congress has affirmed its support for the NIH over the last few years, most recently by including a $2 billion increase in the 2017 omnibus funding bill that the president just signed. In 2015, I led a letter signed by 100 House Republicans, some of which include some of the most fiscally conservative colleagues, that urged House leadership to increase NIH funding by $3 billion, ultimately led to the largest increase in 12 years. So Congress increased it in 2015 when you were still in Congress. Congress increased it last month. This is an area of the budget that saves lives, that invests in research that is going to affect every single one of our families. And if you look at just cancer, with 600,000 people are going to die next year, to me this is a national defense priority. Or if you look at Alzheimer's, where they predict that the cost to Alzheimer's in this country will be $1.1 trillion annually by 2050. So think about that as an OMB. We spend $30 billion annually on medical research. The federal level, $34 billion. Yet we're facing, by 2050, a $1.1 trillion annual price tag for Alzheimer's alone, just one healthcare category. There's 10,000 known diseases in the world. We have cures to 500 of them. To me, Director Mulvaney, this is fiscal conservatism. This is saving lives. This is bending the cost curve on Medicare and Medicaid by curing things like Alzheimer's and cancer. And so, more than anything, I want to put a plug in that this is an important priority and to consider this as an investment. The only other thing I want to, just want to put a plug and maybe ask you quickly on the Violence Against Women Act. There's been some confusion or some concern. I've expressed concern that we would be having any cuts on the Violence Against Women Act budget, and I want to give you a chance to address that issue.
We fully fund that on VAWA.
There's been some concern about the budgetary gimmicks that were used, and I have a lot of constituents that are worried that those grants won't actually end up being there.
I'd be
Can
happy
you
to follow
reassure
up
them
with
that
you
we're fully funding
on that,
Violence Against
Congressman.
Women
But
Act?
my impression from the very get-go, and I've prepped this a couple times, is that we fully fund VAWA. I would love to have a chance to talk about the NIH. Maybe I get a chance to do that.
Yeah, I apologize on the short time we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoder. We'll go to Mr. Quigley and Mr. Stewart. And I'll just remind the members we have a lot of interest here and a lot of questions to get to. And my hope is that we can do more than one question as we go around. So, Mr. Quigley, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, I agree. It would be fun to have a longer, broader discussion. I think one of the things that would have been interesting and fun is if the Secretary who was here last week, Secretary Mnuchin, was alongside you to have a broad-ranging discussions on our philosophies and thoughts on all these issues, because at the very least, it would have been interesting to hear your different views on the debt ceiling, because he clearly made it an imperative that we do this, a clean debt ceiling before the August break. And I may be wrong, but from what I've read, you seem to be in disagreement with the aspects of clean debt ceiling and using other cuts in there before we do this.
Sure, Congressman. And again, I've been asked this question a couple times by the Budget Committee. Yes, I believe that Secretary Mnuchin was asked, and has said several times it's his preference that we would do a clean debt ceiling. I got asked during one of my Senate, I think, hearings about the debt ceiling. I said, look, it's my preference that we try and figure out some way to get spending reforms attached. I would suggest to you that those are completely reasonable positions for any Treasury Secretary and any OMB director to make. The Treasury Secretary wants to raise the debt ceiling because he's concerned about various things, and the OMB, any OMB director would want to try and use the debt ceiling to have a discussion about why you have to raise the debt ceiling. Let me clarify one thing, which is that I want to make it perfectly clear that Mr. Mnuchin speaks for the administration on this. So the fact that we have conversations where I present one side and he presents another does not mean that there's this great division within the administration. Nothing could be further from the truth. What we do agree on is this. We would like very much for y'all to take it up in July. We do think that's imperative. We can get through to September. It's not an emergency situation if you don't get it in July, but we would very much like to see y'all take it up in July and take the pressure off during the August recess, having to worry about when the exact date rolls around. So
yeah, I'm
if
not
there's
sure
one thing we're united on, it's taking it up in July.
But I think what's interesting is the way you argued for that is just the opposite of what he would have, and that is he's Treasury talking about the fact that dealing with our debts long-term has to go through the budgetary process, which is why we call it a clean debt ceiling, right? Because in the end, if you do this the way that you're describing it, and we try to have budget cuts in there as some sort of condition to that, that's really a budgetary process.
Again, I'd be happy to have a long conversation with you about the history of the debt ceiling and how traditionally it has been used by administrations of both parties to try and drive some type of reform into the spending process. But I don't want that to distract from the fact that the Treasury Secretary is in charge of those negotiations for the administration, and it's our position. We'd like you to take it up in July.
Back to what Ms. Lowy said quickly. And I want to make sure, because you tried to clarify this, I think. OMB 2017 enacted, the 2018 request goes from 95 to 103, which is 8%. Standing alone, taking ITOR out, which goes from 27 to 25,
Yeah.
Are you combining those two to say it's a 5% cut? Because OMB, looking at OMB, which is the situation.
Right, but ITOR is part of OMB. It's broken out on the sheet that you see, but ITOR is part of OMB. They answer to me. They're an agency within OMB, just like OFFP and OPPM are. So it's broken out on that piece of paper, but when it comes to the way the place is managed, it's the same. To the first part, I don't know if the number you're looking at is the FY17 enacted or the FY17 CR annualized, so I can't
It says 97 enacted, 95.
Okay.
2017, 95 million.
Okay.
But when you were here, you'd vote against cuts. You voted for cuts of OMB funding. It
voted for a lot
just
of
strikes
cuts.
inherently inconsistent that when you're in the seat and everybody else, virtually everybody else, has to do belt tightening, it doesn't apply to your own
No, sir.
organization.
With respect, not at all. We plussed
Either
up.
way, it's an increase.
It is, and we plussed up spending at the Department of Defense. We plussed up spending within the Department of Energy for atomic energy. We plussed up spending within the Department of Education for school choice.
But all the people you said have to tighten their belt, you can't say because I am too.
Sure we are. ITOR is going down by $2 million.
As a whole, even if you
executive-
include them,
the
you're still a
executive-
$6 million increase, a
And with-
5%.
within the
State
executive-
Department would love a 5% increase.
And within the Executive Office of the President, which is the small agency that we work for, it's a 1% or 2% reduction? 3%. 3%
It
reduction.
goes from 122 to 128, including ITOR. That's still a $6 million increase. It's still a 5% altogether.
It's a 5% within OMB.
Name all the agencies that are getting cut. How many of them would like to get a 5% increase versus the cut that you're talking about? How is that not inconsistent that you can say, well, we need more money, but you're going to have to be more efficient?
President
Just
wants.
speaking to those
Yeah,
entities.
the president wants to spend more money on national defense. My budget does that. The president wants to spend more money on border security. The budget does that. The president wants to spend more money on law enforcement. DOJ budget goes up. President wants to spend more money on veterans. It goes up. President wants to spend more money on deregulating the economy and restructuring the government, which is why you
Respectfully,
see
it still
those.
doesn't explain why you need more money to do the things he's talking about.
Actually, that exactly explains why we need more money.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. And, you know, for the committee's sake here, I mean, the director is making a budget recommendation, right? And he's doing a great job of justifying his decisions for that. It's this committee's job to take those justifications and then apply them to paper and pencil. Mr. Stewart and then Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I commit to you that I will not go over time, so we'll go quickly here. Mr. Mulvaney, welcome. I got to say that when I heard of your appointment to this position, I was surprised, but I think it's a great choice. And I want you to know that two things. One, no one on...
Is Amadei going to say the same thing when it comes his time?
I can't predict a thing in the world, this guy will say. But I want to say that no one on either side of the dais up here can beat you in a debate, which is one of the reasons that we miss you here in Congress, but we do wish you luck. Two observations, if I could. The reason I ran for Congress was a couple years after you was because of our spending and our debt. I felt like we were committing national suicide by that. And I'm going to come back to that point. So thank you and thank the President for taking a serious view that spending and debt is a serious issue that we have to address in a serious way, and we haven't been very successful at doing that. Second observation, 3% growth rate is a great way to do that. And thank you for that goal. And it's a beautiful thing when you see regulatory reform and tax reform and healthcare reform and the integral parts that they play in allowing this economy to grow, the American dream to grow like most of us believe that it can. And that does solve, in many cases, to an enormous degree, the problem we have with our spending and our debt. Now to my question, if I could, I wanted to go quickly on this first one. You did mention, and by the way, I was going to ask what Mr. Yoder did, essentially the mandatory spending side. And those of us who I believe, like you, Mr. Mulvaney, who believe and understand you've got to talk about the mandatory side. I mean, I can't tell you how many meetings I've had with groups over the last 2 months who look at the budget, scared to death. They come in and they're saying, hey, they're going to cut this program, they're going to cut this program. And I say, you know, we talk about that, but I say, go to your Democratic friends, because most of them come from a liberal Democratic background, and I say to them, go convince them that they've got to work with us on the mandatory spending, because until they do, all of this pressure is going to fall on you. And that's just the truth. You mentioned, though, that there was some mandatory spending reductions in this budget. Will you elaborate on that? And if you could, I'm going to ask both questions quickly and then let you. Sitting on Intel and as a former Air Force pilot, most of my work here in Congress is in national security and protecting American people. And I don't know, Mick, if you need me to wait while you confer. Okay. It's a chaotic and dangerous world, and like many, I've kind of come through this. I've moved a little bit in the sense the thing that drove me here was spending, debt, but also recognizing now that our national security is a primary responsibility of the federal government, and we live, as I said, in a dangerous world. Can you help us understand your thoughts on balancing, the administration's thoughts on balancing those two priorities? So mandatory spending examples, if you could, and then balancing.
Mandatory spending examples, not Social Security retirement and Medicare. We assumed that the House AHCA Healthcare Act would pass. That's a big piece of the mandatory reforms. We reformed the Medicaid and CHIP program. I think we changed some of the growth rates there. That's a mandatory program. Welfare reform, which includes SSDI. We had significant reforms there. We reformed this federal student loan program, which is a mandatory program. Again, you could go down the list. There's a lot. You're absolutely right, Congressman Stewart, that Social Security and Medicare make up big parts of the mandatory, but I think what folks don't realize is that there are other things that contribute to it as well.
Okay, and if I could, Mr. Mulvaney, thank you for that. And I wanted to ask a question for a couple of reasons. Number one is to start the conversation, help the American people. The Republicans are willing to take on this challenge, as you've demonstrated there. But we have a ways to go, as I think we can agree, with Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. Yes, okay.
I do. Like I said, I was surprised when we were able to balance the budget within the 10-year window without reforming those programs. My guess is that we won't be able to do that again next year.
Okay. Second question, the priority of military spending, national security, and
the President instructed me to write the top-line defense number to 603 because that is the exact number that undoes the sequester. If we had not had the sequester in place, which many folks on both sides of the aisle agree has been deleterious to the defense of this nation, the number this year would have been 603, and that's how we picked the number.
Okay. Do you feel like that number is sufficient?
You know, I've talked with Congressman Thornberry. I've talked with folks at DOD. We think it's sufficient, but if this body sees fit to do more than that, certainly you'll get no objections from this administration. Our goal was to follow through on the promise that the president made to undo the sequester, and that number is precisely 603.
Okay, and then I'll conclude with this. And Mr. Chairman, I will end on time with 23 seconds. Again, coming from the background that the reason I ran was because of we can destroy our country with debt. But having moved now to this position that there is now a more urgent priority, I'll tell you that the will of Congress might be that 603 is not sufficient, and we'll examine that. So with that, I yield back my 2 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Great job. Great example for everyone here. Mr. Cartwright and then Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Mulvaney, for being here. Nice to see your face again. Your budget is proposing massive domestic spending cuts. I certainly support military spending, a safe America, a strong national defense, but at some point we have to ask where do we draw the line with these budget reductions. It seems that this administration is targeting programs for cuts, popular programs across the aisle, popular programs. We'll talk about that a little bit. For cuts in a manner that is nothing short of myopic, short-sighted, Director. For example, cuts to my colleague, Representative Yoder, talked about National Institutes of Health. How are we going to cure cancer if we go around cutting the NIH? My colleague, Chairman Frelinghuysen, has vocally objected to cuts to NOAA and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. These are enormous supports for American business who rely on these, and they're job creators. Why do we want to cut those? Chairman Culberson has talked about the inadvisability of cuts to the National Science Foundation as well. This is where pure scientific research happens and has been the basis for so many scientific discoveries that are huge job creators in this country. For another example, your budget slashes the $3.65 million budget for regional climate centers to a mere $650,000. I've spoken to numerous individuals from these centers. I can tell you that this proposed cut will simply shut them down. Additionally, in a March White House press briefing, when asked about proposed cuts to CDBGs, Community Development Block Grants, enormously important grants to the localities, specifically with how that money funds important programs like Meals on Wheels, you stated, quote, "Meals on Wheels sounds great, but to take that federal money and give it to the states and say, look, we want to give you money for programs that don't work, I can't defend that anymore," unquote. You said that, Director Mulvaney, but when you say Meals on Wheels doesn't work, let me help you with that. Here's how you know if Meals on Wheels works. This is delivering meals to homebound seniors. You can tell it works when you deliver the food to them and they eat the food and they continue to live.
Mr. Cartwright, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I will point out that the Washington Post retracted that story. That's not accurate.
A 2013 National Institute of Health study of the Meals on Wheels program found that home-delivered meal programs for seniors, quote, significantly improve diet quality, increase nutrient intakes, and reduce food insecurity and nutritional risk among participants. Other beneficial outcomes include increased socialization opportunities, improvement in dietary adherence, and higher quality of life. I want to ask a question here. What specific process did your office use to decide which programs to cut? among the ones that I've just mentioned.
Let's see. Okay, on the CDBGs, the Meals on Wheels comment, as I mentioned, the next day the Washington Post retracted that. I never said that. And the CDBG program, at best, funds about 3% of Meals on Wheels. We actually think, we agree with you, Congressman, the Meals on Wheels program is actually one of the ones that does work, which is why we didn't make any reduction to its primary source of funding, which is the Administration Community Living Program within HHS. NSF, where you contended that pure scientific research takes place, last year they did a climate change musical. I would suggest to you that's not pure scientific research. On the NIH, again, we agree with everybody here that the government should be involved in this type of research. We spend $28 billion to do that. Let me say, that's $28,000 million on NIH as part of this budget. But more importantly, it is a reduction, Mr. Cartwright, from last year. If you get a grant from the Gates Foundation, the Gates Foundation will tell you for a research project that you have to spend 90% of that on actual research. You can only spend 10% on administrative costs. Okay? We don't do that at the federal level, and as a result, when people get our money, they spend 27% of it on administrative costs.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm going to respectfully redirect you, Director.
Yes, sir.
And because I'm asking about the process. And I'd like to get an idea of how much granular involvement the President had on the line items in this proposed budget. Did President Trump specifically go over each of these cuts to NIH, NOAA, NIST, National Science Foundation? Did you go over them line by line with the President?
I can't remember how many lines are in there, Mr. Quigley. It's probably more than
Cartwright.
4 or 5. Cartwright, I'm sorry. I'm sitting there. I'm not even, I can't remember which glasses to put on at which time, so I can't see. That I don't think it's reasonable to say that he go through line by line like we did in the office. The President and I sat down and spent several hours over several different days on various parts of the budget, and I can assure you that this does reflect the message that he wanted to deliver to Congress, which is, this is my priorities. Please spend more money here. I don't want to add to the deficit this year, so I want reductions in other programs, and I need to balance the budget within 10 years. I'd be happy to talk in the second round about how we made decisions about which programs to prioritize within that guidelines, but I know you're
Maybe we'll
out of
do
time.
that, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Let me, I'll just note for the committee and for the director that I know Mr. Cartwright personally, and had he known that story had been retracted, he wouldn't have
Absolutely, and
referenced
that's why
that
I
story
cut
at
it
all.
off. I'm
So I
sorry.
appreciate you bringing that forward, and let it be noted that the story was retracted and the director never made those comments. To Mr. Young and then Mr. Bishop. I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Young.
Director Mulvaney, thank you for being with us today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're taking on a lot of new responsibilities. Critical regulatory reform processes. A lot of executive orders have come out, reducing regulation and controlling regulatory costs, enforcing the regulatory reform agenda, regulatory planning and review, the requirement that federal agencies identify at least 2 regulatory actions for each new regulation they issue. This is included in your statement. We've heard a lot about it. I'm excited about that. We live in a regulatory state, in my opinion. It's a priority of the administration to tackle the regulatory regime. It's a priority of many members of Congress. It's, we started out with the REINS Act and other bills to get a control of our rules and regulations and the regulatory scheme. It's a priority of the American people. I hear about it all the time back home, particularly how those who are regulating us, they don't know who they are. They're nameless and they're faceless. So transparency, I think, is a key that you should consider factoring in when it comes to reforming our regulatory process. When I introduce a bill, and my colleagues do, or an amendment, I got to put my name on it. The American people, when they're in the economy and selling a product, they got to put their name on it. They got to own it. When you own something, you put your name on it, you're going to offer a better product because it's all going to come back to you. Your budget summary. Thank you for this. At the very end of it, you list 500 names of those people who were involved in writing that and helping out. Thank you for that transparency. That's very helpful. Could you do that when it comes to the regulations that come out of our agencies and departments? You could do that in a directive, in my opinion, or perhaps through an executive order by the president. This budget is a recommendation, but you could implement a more transparent regulatory process by mandating that those who write the rules and regulations and promulgate them, they put their name on it. They put their title on it too, so we know that they are at least experts in that field. I have a bill called the Fingerprints Act, and this is exactly what it does. It just says it requires regulators to include their names and titles on the rules they help promulgate. We can end the nameless, faithless bureaucracy. Many of these people, I'm sure, are well-intended and good people, but why shouldn't we know who they are? They're affecting our lives in serious ways. So I would ask that you and the president and the people you work with in the administration help tackle the regulatory regime by simply bringing more transparency. When those people put their names on the rules and regulations they put out there and promulgate, they're going to offer a better product to the American people. There's going to be more accountability, more transparency. It's better for all of us, in my opinion. And I'll just close with that and ask you to comment with about the 2 minutes I have left, because I want to hear, tell me what is happening with helping to ease the rules and regulations that have been landed upon the American people.
Thank you, Congressman, and that's actually, wasn't aware of the bill. I'd be happy to take a look at that and take that back to the White House.
We'll give you a copy of it before you leave.
It's fascinating. I would worry about how deep you go down in the process. I had a great, by the way, I did know that folks put their name on the back of that. This is the first budget I've done, and I was, like you, just stunned in a positive sense that people are willing to put their name. I thought that was great.
500 names here.
I cannot speak highly enough of the folks who work at OMB. I would worry if you made it broader, if it doesn't have a chilling effect, if the very low-ranking people who don't want it, but I'd be happy to look at it because I think you've hit a nail on the head, which
we can have a great conversation about
nameless, faceless bureaucrats. It's a great point. What are we trying to do? We've done two things so far. We've put in the 2-for-1 that you've mentioned. We've also put in a regulatory budget, which essentially says if you pass a new regulation, Mr. Quigley, that costs American business $1, you have to find some place to offset that by reducing a regulation that saves them $1, to try and bring some rationale, some balance to the system. I will tell you this, the biggest challenge that we faced as an administration so far is teaching a whole wing of the government that hasn't deregulated in a long time how to do it. I mean, face it, they're trying to use muscles that we haven't used in many circumstances since the 1980s. I mean, you're asking agencies to deregulate. If you want to put out a new one, you have to get rid of 2 of the old ones. That means you have to deregulate. And there's folks who have worked there for 20 years who've never done that. So it's been a lot more of a challenge than we thought, but it continues to be a priority of the president. He mentions it to him every time I talk to him. What are we doing to make the regulatory burden less? We do believe that is an absolute key to getting to that 3% growth rate that is a target for us, a goal for us, and in fact, the country absolutely needs.
To get to that 3% growth rate, tax reform, a strong trade agenda, and regulatory reform.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Director Mulvaney, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Young, I understand that votes likely will happen in the next 10 to 25 minutes, and we still have 3 members who have yet to ask a question. So, Mr. Bishop, thank you for your patience, and then we'll go to Mr. Molnar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome again, Director Mulvaney. Director, I've been very troubled by your recent comments disparaging the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan organization tasked with evaluating how bills in Congress would affect the budget, the economy, and other important indicators. Apparently, I'm not alone in my concerns. According to a June 1st article in The Hill, other former CBO directors, Democrat and Republican, have said that your efforts to disparage the CBO reflects more poorly on your credibility than on the CBO's. The Hill quoted Douglas Holtz-Eakin, a former CBO director who served as an advisor on Senator McCain's presidential campaign, who said in a tweet that your words are, quote, are a disgrace, reflect more poorly on him, meaning you, than CBO, and show budget ignorance, should apologize. As a former member of the House Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over the CBO, I've been very impressed by the dedication and professionalism of the CBO staff. Do you really, truly believe that the day of, that quote, the day of the CBO has come and gone, end quote, as the article quoted you, or is it just a question of sour grapes? Because the CBO did not provide the administration with the answer that it was looking for on the Trump Care House Republican health care bill.
A couple of different things on that, Mr. Bishop. I would suggest to you that some of the criticisms of the CBO's methodology are absolutely valid, and questioning whether or not it's doing a good job now and has done a good job in the past is an absolutely valid question for us to ask, and that you should be asking. When they assume, when they score coverage of the AHCA, that people who are getting Medicaid for free will give it up if the federal mandate goes away. That's one of their assumptions. Think about that for a second. You're getting something for free, but if a mandate goes away that says you have to take it, you'll give it up. You'd rather be uncovered than received free Medicaid. That is a valid criticism. To your point, however, about the personal attacks, if I could, thank you for the opportunity. We'd released a statement. I'll read it as quickly as I can. It has come to my attention that my friend and colleague, Congressman John Yarmuth, has suggested that in my attempt to challenge the CBO's recent analysis of the AHCA, I impugned the integrity of a public servant. John is correct, and for that I'd like to apologize. Within any organization, the buck should stop at the top. At CBO, that means the director, not individual civil servants. It is the director who bears the ultimate responsibility. That was printed in the press, by the way. I didn't have access to the actual place. So to a certain extent, I would agree with you, Mr. Bishop. It was wrong for me to attack the individual. It is absolutely, I think, necessary for us to continue to press the entities, the organizations that we give so much authority. The CBO has authority that the OMB doesn't even come close to having. There are bills that the Senate cannot take up if the CBO says they cannot take them up. Think about that for a second. I can't think of any other federal agency that we give that kind of authority to. So I think with that kind of authority, they have great responsibility to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that their methodologies are not polluted with bias.
Mr. Mulvaney, what you're asking is the impossible. For generation after generation after generation, as long as CBO has operated, it has operated with acceptable standards on a bipartisan basis. And it has only gotten to the point where, on a partisan basis, where certain folks did not feel that the CBO was giving them the answer that they were looking for, that they began to question their impartiality.
Actually, Mr. Bishop, I will send you the questions of the Democrats raised about the CBO during the scoring of the original Affordable Care Act 10 years ago. So believe me, you're absolutely right. There has been partisanship in the CBO, but I can assure you it did not start with this organization.
I'm not suggesting that it started.
Yeah.
There. I'm just suggesting that it seems that the criticisms come when individuals don't like what the results are. I think this is a prime example of it, and particularly, you know, the methodology that's used. You know, dynamic scoring, for example, was not considered very, very reliable, but all of a sudden, since dynamic scoring gives more flexibility, some folks now in the administration would rather have it.
I believe that challenging the methodology of an organization like the CBO is a completely legitimate function of both the Congress and the administrative branch.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Molinar, and then Mr. Amity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Mulvaney, good to have you with us. A couple things I wanted to talk with you about. One is the SULOCs, and I wouldn't expect you to be overly familiar with that, but it's an area where each year approximately 8,000 vessels carry an average of 80 million tons of iron ore, coal, stone, grain, and other commercial cargo through the SULOCs in northern Michigan. And for decades, the federal government, Congress, and the private industry has acknowledged that the SULOCs are integral to the regional and national economy. Yet there is a 50-year-old PO lock, which remains a single vulnerability in a multi-billion-dollar supply chain. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Homeland Security called the PO lock the Achilles heel of the Great Lakes navigation system and the North American industrial economy, respectively. And according to DHS, an extended, unexpected shutdown could cost 11 million Americans their jobs and a $1.1 trillion decrease in economic activity. The project to replace and modernize this lock was first authorized in 1986, 31 years ago, and has had numerous studies on its national significance. One of the concerns that we have is how to get this on the radar screen, because there are different ways of evaluating what is a significant project. I understand the OMB uses a discount rate of 7%. The Army Corps uses a discount rate of 3.125%. And we're asking for your help on how to best define this significance of this project and how we can best move forward.
Thank you, Congressman. And while I'm not specifically, as you mentioned, familiar with that, I did know it was important to you, and I think your office may have reached out to me on this time for time, and I do appreciate your attention to it. Having represented a district like you do, I understand that these things can be a big deal for the folks back home. Part of my answer is I don't know. I just found out recently, for example, that we use different discount rates for different parts of this analysis. That some of us use 7%, and I think the chief's report uses 3.125%. I think another part of the process uses a 0.7% discount rate. It makes no sense to me yet. We will continue to look at it because what we're trying to do is fix the process, not only so that it functions better for taxpayers, but that we can understand it. Go back to Mr. Young's point about transparency. I think it's fair for you to say, look, I understand that from time to time my programs might get approved or disapproved, but it's fair to you to be able to have you understand how we arrived at that conclusion in a way that you can explain to folks back home. And right now, I'm not sure we can do that. So what I tell you is I will look forward to working with you and with other members who have very similar issues to try and rationalize the process so that we can explain it to ourselves and to the folks that we represent.
Great, thank you. Just one last question, also on the topic of the Great Lakes, which we have discussed in the past, and I thank you for your response to my letter on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which was eliminated funding in the EPA's budget. Just some thoughts on this. The Great Lakes hold nearly 20% of the world's freshwater supply, 95% of our nation's supply of fresh surface water, and provide drinking water for 48 million people. And it supports a $5 trillion economy, 30% of the U.S. and Canadian economic activity. It's an international border, and I guess, I understand the philosophy of having states take a portion of responsibilities in different areas, but this is clearly one that has different countries involved, 8 states involved, a huge percent of our fresh water, and I just, would like your thoughts on what the federal role might be in supporting so that we don't have invasive species, so we don't have huge problems in the Great Lakes.
Yeah, actually, Congressman, thank you, because you've mentioned something that I didn't consider when we went through the process, which is that there is an international component here. I will tell you what we went through, and by the way, we're trying to find out, we think this may be one of the programs that is unauthorized, and that put it on a radar for us, because we don't like unauthorized programs. And we do think that if a program is important enough to spend money on, that y'all should authorize it. So we didn't defund all of the unauthorized programs. It would actually be very difficult to do that. I think that represents $300 billion plus worth of discretionary spending every single year. But we looked at regional programs with a very close perspective under the theory, is it right to ask taxpayers in Alabama to pay for a regional thing? I know that there were some issues that were important to Mrs. Herrera-Butler that affected her region as well. We looked at things through the perspective of was it authorized? But you've given me a thing that I've not considered, and I'd be happy to talk with you about that further, which is there is an international component which may make it more federal than I thought it was before we chatted.
Thank you.
Thank you
for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Molinar. With less than 10 minutes on the vote clock.
Are you sure we can't go? You want to gavel us down and not do this, or?
No, I've been waiting in anticipation for Mr. Amadei's question, and he's been very patient and enduring all day today. So, Mr. Amadei, thanks
all day
for staying all day.
Thank you for the 120 seconds. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I want to make sure, Mr. Director, that and disassociate myself from any of the racist remarks about a poll lock, whether that's one word or 2 words that the previous speaker made.
My Oslowski family will appreciate that, Mr. Amadei. Thank you
I am
very
also
much.
gratified to see that the part that went into this budget was the assumption of the AHCA would pass. So I know that those references to me did not come from the administration, and I appreciate that on the record here today. I'm gonna be real abbreviated. I've got a couple of regulatory things that we'll submit to you offline. Real quick, can you give me an idea of how you came to the top line number for Interior?
No.
Okay.
The top line number for interior, because I think we did it we didn't start with a top line. We went program by program and backed into a top line. So I've honestly,
Okay.
yes.
I'd
I
like
can
to
tell you how we got to the top line number for non-defense discretionary writ large, but I can't get down
I'm
to
not
the next
interested
level.
in that. There's other people that'll do that.
Okay.
But I'll get back with you on that. But let me tell you why I ask you the question. And this administration is not unique in terms of Democrats, Republicans, previous folks. But as we look at things out in the neck of the woods where the federal government tends to own more of the land west of the Rockies than other people do, I think it creates, not that there aren't interior issues nationwide, but it creates a special position for the major landowner. And so when I look at interior, and I'm not a guy who says more money makes sense for better government or anything else like that, but I guess when I look at that and I look at the problems that you experience when you talk about staffing and things like that, I would like to know if there are any plans in your office to take a look at the history for things like the Bureau of Land Management and say, how many people do you have working? Where are they working? Are they working within the Beltway? Are they working out in the provinces? How has staffing, because I can tell you that out in the field, as you talk about your prior experience, when you've got a very active state with realty issues and they're staffed at 25% in those field offices, you're like, are we doing this to ourselves internally, or is this a function of top-line cuts that are coming down from Republican and Democratic administrations? And the last piece I'll put on that is when we sit there and talk about a $230 million deal in the unobligated funds from the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act to be used for broader taxpayer use, part of me says, hey, touche. But the other part of me says, well, listen, if you're going to cut the budget for the outfit that owns 85+% of my state, so I want them to have the resources to operate in some responsible manner, at least direct it someplace where we're doing those cuts. Or when you're looking at not fully funding PILT, which is like, well, that's fine, use this to fund some of that. But to just say we're sweeping that into other areas, in my mind, means we're going to use that to balance the books. I get that. There's nothing criminal about that. But when you looked at that also in the context of it's a public land sales account from the same administration that's saying we don't want to transfer another square foot, but we don't want to pay PILT and we don't want to fund them. So, you know, there's just a whole lot of moving parts in there that may not be moving in the same direction. So my request would be, since I know it's not the center of operating the federal government universe, but I would appreciate it if there is a regional person in your office or whomever to be able to sit down with and say, hey, can we talk about some of these things just so that the office is fully read in from the perspective of somebody who's a couple thousand miles west of the Potomac?
Thank you for that. And by the way, I'll say this, because being a Southerner and having come here without spending a lot of time out west, I think the Western Caucus, the delegations from out there, especially Nevada, Montana, Arizona, did a great deal of teaching me how things are different out there. And it never occurred to me that the federal government owns most of your state, and for that reason doesn't pay taxes on property, and your property tax is just, your tax base is just different. And that was an eye-opener to me, and we have tried to carry that perspective through as we look towards various portions of the budgets. I know there'll be pieces you'll disagree with, things you'll like. I will compliment Secretary Zinke, who clearly gets that issue. And I encourage you to stay in touch with him as well, because he seems to zone in on a lot of what you just talked about, which is how much of the Department of the Interior, which encompasses a lot of what you just talked about, is inside the Beltway, and how much of it is actually doing the job that it's supposed to be doing. And I've been very impressed with the work that he's done in a very short period of time. I look forward then to working with you. Listen, let's look at a larger issue. This is the 2018 budget. That actually started long before the election, let alone my arrival at OMB. As we go into the 2019 budget, which actually starts in September of this year, I look forward to working with Mr. Amadeus to get a better handle on how the budget proposals impact the western states.
Thank you, and I yield back with more time than Stewart, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Amadeus. Mr. Director, thanks again for joining us today, for your time, your thoughtful responses to the very thoughtfulness of the questions here on this committee. We have one of the most amazing committees where a lot of research is done and a lot of interest and passion. So thanks for your time. There will be additional questions that will be submitted for the record, and we would just ask that your office try to respond back as promptly as possible within 30 days would really help us finish our work here as it would for all the other subcommittees and appropriations. But it's great to have you back. Congratulations on your new role, and you're always welcome back to the House. With that, we're adjourned.